All right, so today we're diving into some pretty complex and maybe even a little controversial territory.
Yeah.
The arguments for a potential secession of the Igbo-Biafra region from Nigeria.
Hmm.
We're going to be looking at excerpts from a document by
Okay.
Uchemefor, who's a leader in the Igbo-Biafra independence movement.
Right.
And, this is just one perspective on a very multifaceted issue. So, as always,
Yeah.
keep those critical thinking caps on as we go through this.
I like that.
What did you find compelling about this case?
Well, one of the things that I found really fascinating about this document is how it's trying to bridge this gap between historical claims
Right.
and modern-day grievances.
Yeah.
And they start by asserting this historical right to independence.
Okay.
They argue that the Igbo-Biafra region had a distinct cultural and linguistic identity long before
Yeah.
colonial borders were drawn.
So they're saying those colonial borders were kind of like artificial constructs
Exactly.
that ignored existing realities.
Precisely, they argue that the
Yeah.
arbitrary nature of those borders just exacerbated this feeling of separateness.
Which, if we look at history, is a recurring theme
Right.
in a lot of these self-determination movements all over the world.
All the time.
How often were those colonial borders drawn with any real consideration for the people actually living in those regions?
It's a very common thread,
Right.
and it often leads to these kinds of long-standing tensions and struggles for autonomy.
Yeah.
But what I think makes this case particularly compelling is how they connect those historical claims to present-day injustices.
Okay, so let's unpack that.
Okay.
What are some of the specific grievances that they're highlighting?
So they detail some pretty serious allegations of human rights violations against the Igbo population within Nigeria.
Right.
We're talking documented cases of discrimination, violence, marginalization.
And they specifically reference the Biafran War, right?
Yes.
That conflict from 1967 to 1970,
Right.
which I vaguely recall,
Yes.
was incredibly brutal and resulted in the deaths of millions of people,
Yes.
many of whom were Igbo.
And they argue that the atrocities committed during that war,
Right?
which they allege amounted to genocide,
Right.
are a key part of their case.
Wow.
They even go so far as to claim that there's this ongoing, subtle but very real system of structural apartheid against the Southeast.
Wow.
They're essentially using this history of violence and discrimination
Right.
to make a case for something called remedial secession.
Remedial secession.
Yeah,
That sounds intense.
it's a relatively new concept
Okay.
in international law, but it is gaining some traction. The basic idea is that if a state fails to protect its citizens
Right.
from violence and persecution,
Right.
or worse, becomes the perpetrator of those acts,
Yeah.
then a group may have grounds for secession as a remedy
So it's almost like a last resort. Yeah.
when every other avenue has been exhausted.
Think of it as like an emergency exit
Right.
in a really bad situation.
Okay.
You know?
So in their view, they've been denied basic human rights and protections within Nigeria, and secession is the only way
Right.
to ensure their safety and security.
That's the sentiment that they're expressing.
It's like saying, we've tried to make it work within this system, but we've been pushed to a point where we have no other choice.
Exactly. And to support this claim of systemic discrimination,
Right.
they point to some pretty stark examples.
Okay.
One that really stood out to me is this disparity
Okay.
in the number of states allocated to each region in Nigeria.
Right. I remember reading about this. The Southeast, where the Igbo-Biafra region is located,
Right.
has fewer states than other regions.
Yes.
Which, if I'm following you correctly, translates to less representation in the national government. They argue that this deliberate underrepresentation is a clear sign of marginalization
Right.
and a key factor driving their desire for self-determination.
It seems like a vicious cycle. The less representation they have, the more marginalized they feel,
Right.
which only fuels their desire for self-governance.
Precisely. And this leads directly into their next major point,
Okay.
which is discrimination and lack of representation
Right.
within the Nigerian government. They argue that this lack of political voice
Yeah.
strengthens their claim to self-determination under international law, which often sees self-determination as a safeguard for minority groups' rights.
But hold on, haven't there been attempts
Yes.
to address some of these concerns within the existing Nigerian system?
Absolutely.
I vaguely recall something about a national conference back in 2014.
Yes.
Didn't the Southeast participate in that?
They did, but the document claims that the Nigerian government essentially ignored the outcomes and recommendations relevant to the Southeast.
So it's like they're saying, look, we've tried to work within the system.
Yeah.
We've tried to have our voices heard, but we're constantly hitting a brick wall.
Right.
And it sounds like, sadly, their relationship with the Nigerian security forces isn't helping matters.
That's one of the most concerning aspects highlighted in this document.
What are they saying about that?
They claim that the Nigerian security forces operating in the Southeast are engaged in human rights violations, specifically targeting the Igbo population, particularly the youth.
So are they alleging that this is a deliberate attempt to suppress self-determination movements?
Yes.
Wow.
They argue that this targeting is discriminatory, designed to instill fear and silence dissent.
Okay.
They even draw this chilling comparison between the security operations in the Southeast and those in other regions of Nigeria.
So they're saying that the approach taken in the Southeast is demonstrably different.
Yes.
Suggesting a more sinister motive behind the crackdown.
That's their argument.
Wow. So we've got historical grievances, allegations of present-day discrimination, and this really worrisome claim about security forces being used to suppress their movement.
That's a lot.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
But I get the sense there's more to unpack here.
There is. They go on to list several other historical incidents that, in their view, demonstrate a consistent pattern of dismissing the concerns of the Igbo Biafra people.
Okay.
They point to the Nigerian government's rejection of a petition by the Ohanis and Digbo, which sought to address historical grievances related to the Biafran War.
Which is significant because the Ohanis and Digbo is a prominent Igbo sociocultural organization,
Exactly.
Not just some fringe group.
Right, and the fact that their petition was rejected, they argue, reveals a broader pattern of disregard for their concerns.
It's like they're saying every time we try to address these past wrongs, we're met with resistance and dismissal.
Right.
But perhaps even more concerning is their claim that the Nigerian government violated the terms of surrender that were agreed upon at the end of the Biafran War in 1970.
Right.
What do they say about that?
So they specifically allege that the government unilaterally modified the administrative and political systems of Nigeria, going against the consensus that was stipulated in the surrender agreement.
So they're claiming a breach of trust.
Essentially.
Which they believe further undermines Nigeria's legitimacy in governing the region.
Right.
They're really building a systematic and deeply rooted case for their right to self-determination.
They are.
And to drive home the point. They even use the term sui generis to describe their situation. Okay. I'm going to need you to break that down for me.
Okay.
It sounds like some fancy legal jargon.
It essentially means unique
Okay.
or of its own kind.
Okay.
They argue that the Igbo Biafra case is unique because of the entrenched and systematic nature of the discrimination that they face.
So they're saying that the level of deliberate and intentional marginalization they've experienced goes beyond anything that could be considered typical or commonplace.
Exactly.
So it sounds like they're laying the groundwork for a legal argument here.
Yes.
They're saying that their situation is so exceptional, so extreme, that it justifies secession as a remedy.
That's what they're doing.
Wow. So how do they...
But of course, international law is incredibly complex.
Right.
Proving a case for secession is no easy feat.
Right.
So how do they try to demonstrate that they meet the criteria for self-determination under international law?
Well, that sounds like the perfect place to pick up when we come back.
I can't wait.
So before the break, we were really getting into the weeds of this secession argument. The Igbo Biafra movement is claiming they meet the criteria for self-determination under international law, which is...
It's a tough one.
Yeah, a pretty high bar to clear.
Yeah, you can't just declare yourself a people entitled to self-determination.
Right.
There are very specific legal precedents and criteria that need to be met.
Okay, so what are those criteria?
Okay.
And how does the Igbo Biafra movement argue that they fulfill them?
Well, one of the first hurdles is establishing that they qualify as a distinct people
Right.
in the eyes of international law. And the document lays out this pretty comprehensive argument,
Okay.
hitting on all the key points.
Walk me through it.
Okay.
What are they highlighting?
So they start with this concept of shared identity.
Okay.
They argue that the Igbo people, with their unique language, cultural practices,
Right.
shared history, clearly constitute a distinct and cohesive group.
It's like they're saying, look, we're not just some random collection of individuals who happen to live in the same geographic area.
Exactly.
We have a shared identity, a collective consciousness that sets us apart.
And they go beyond just those cultural arguments.
Oh.
Highlighting the southeastern region as like a defined territory, a tangible space that they can claim as their own.
So they have a people. They have a land. What else do they need to bolster their case?
They highlight the fact that they already have functioning governmental structures within the Southeast.
Okay.
Even though they are part of the Nigerian federal system, they have their own administrative institutions that provide services to their population.
So they're not just talking about aspirations for self-governance. They're pointing to existing structures on the ground.
Exactly.
That's a pretty strong argument.
Yes, and they don't stop there.
Okay.
They emphasize their defined population, their demographic stability, arguing that this strengthens their right to assert their collective rights and interests.
It's like they're saying, look, we have deep roots here.
Yes.
We're not going anywhere, and we have a right to determine our own future.
That's a great way to put it, and here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
They argue that they have the capacity to engage in international relations.
Really?
Yeah.
How do they back that claim up?
That's a bold claim.
Right. It's not like they have their own embassies.
Right.
Or negotiating treaties on the world stage.
It's more about the potential.
Okay.
They're saying that they have the potential to establish diplomatic ties and participate in global affairs.
Okay.
It's about projecting this image of themselves as a viable entity in the international arena, capable of functioning as an independent state.
So it's more about demonstrating that they have the necessary building blocks, the capacity to operate on a global level, even if they're not doing so right now.
Precisely. And of course, they circle back to that core issue of systemic discrimination, arguing that their experience within Nigeria underscores this urgent need for self-governance as a means of protecting their rights and ensuring their future.
It's really a multifaceted argument.
Yes.
They're weaving together these threads of identity, territory, governance, international relations, and the experience of discrimination.
To make their case.
Yeah, to make their case for self-determination.
For self-determination.
It's a well-constructed argument.
It is, but remember, there are always multiple perspectives and counter-arguments to consider.
Of course, and we'll definitely get into those.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I want to circle back to this concept of internal self-determination that you mentioned earlier.
Right.
It seems to play a key role in their argument.
It does. They're essentially arguing that they've been denied even this basic level of self-determination within Nigeria.
Okay.
They claim that they don't have a genuine sense of belonging within the current system, and they point to very specific reasons for that.
What are some of those reasons?
So they point to things like being restricted to only 5 states, which they believe creates this imbalance in political representation and resource allocation.
They're not just talking about abstract concepts. They're tying this argument to very real disadvantages that they're experiencing.
Under the current system.
Under the current system. So it's like they're saying, look, we've tried to make it work within this structure, but the deck is stacked against us. Even the most basic level of self-determination is being denied to us.
And it's this perceived denial of internal self-determination that they believe justifies their pursuit of external self-determination through secession.
So it's like they're being forced into this corner where they're saying, look, we've exhausted all other options. We're left with no choice but to seek full independence.
It's a powerful statement, and it really gets to the heart of the emotional and psychological dimensions of this movement.
Right. It's not just about legal arguments. It's about this deep sense of injustice and this longing for recognition and agency.
Right.
Now, there's one more thing I want to touch on before we move on. The document uses some pretty strong language.
Yes.
When describing their situation, even comparing it to apartheid.
Right.
Which is
a very loaded term.
A very loaded term, obviously. And not something to be thrown around lightly.
It carries a lot of historical baggage.
Yeah.
Evokes a very specific and horrific chapter in human history.
So how do they justify using such a strong term?
Well, they argue that the level of deliberate and intentional marginalization that they've experienced is comparable to the systematic segregation and oppression that was imposed under apartheid in South Africa.
That's a serious accusation.
It is.
Are they able to provide concrete examples to support that claim?
So they point to a range of policies and practices that they believe demonstrate a pattern of systemic discrimination.
Like what?
Things like limited representation in government, economic policies that disproportionately harm the Igbo community, a pervasive culture of oppression that they believe permeates all aspects of their lives.
So they're not just talking about isolated incidents or individual acts of prejudice. They're arguing that there's a deliberate and systematic effort to keep them in a subordinate position.
Exactly. They're alleging that it's not just about personal biases. It's about a system that's designed to disadvantage them.
Right. And this comparison to apartheid is their way of highlighting the severity of their situation, of saying, look, this isn't just about feeling marginalized or being treated unfairly. This is about a fundamental denial of our human rights and our dignity.
Exactly. And by invoking the specter of apartheid, they're hoping to draw international attention to their plight. It's a way of saying, the world condemned apartheid. We're asking for that same level of scrutiny and condemnation for what we're experiencing in Nigeria.
That's a bold tactic.
It is.
And it certainly adds another layer of complexity to this already multifaceted issue.
It does. And remember, what we've discussed here is just one perspective, one side of a very complex story.
We need to be cautious about drawing any definitive conclusions based on a single source.
Absolutely.
But this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has. And I think one of the most important takeaways is that understanding these kinds of self-determination movements requires us to go beyond the headlines. We need to delve into the historical context, the lived experiences, and the deep-seated grievances that fuel these movements.
Absolutely. We can't just ignore the past and pretend it has no bearing on the present.
Exactly.
Those wounds run deep, and they need to be acknowledged and addressed.
Yes, and I think it's crucial to recognize that these movements are often rooted in very real historical grievances and unresolved injustices.
We can't just dismiss them as irrational or disruptive.
Right. We need to engage with those underlying issues if we hope to find lasting solutions.
This has been incredibly eye-opening.
It has.
We've explored so much. The historical grievances, the legal arguments, the human rights concerns.
Absolutely.
The concept of self-determination. And this whole idea of navigating identity and belonging within a nation state.
It's a lot.
It is a lot.
And what's particularly fascinating to me is how this case kind of reflects these broader global trends.
What do you mean by that?
We're seeing this resurgence of self-determination movements all over the world, often driven by these very similar factors. Historical grievances, perceptions of injustice, desire for greater autonomy or recognition.
It's like those unresolved issues from the past have a way of bubbling up to the surface and demanding attention in the present.
And in a way, the Igbo Biafra movement is like a microcosm of this global phenomenon.
And the rise of social media and global interconnectedness has only amplified these voices and created new platforms for mobilization and organization. It's almost like the nation state as a concept is being challenged and reshaped by these forces of identity, globalization, and the quest for self-determination.
That's a great way to put it. The Igbo Biafra case, with all its complexities and nuances, really does offer this valuable lens through which to examine these broader trends.
So as we're wrapping up, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will reflect on?
Well, I hope, first and foremost, this conversation has encouraged people to think critically about the concept of self-determination. What does it really mean? What are the factors that drive these movements? And what challenges do they pose to existing power structures?
It's not just some abstract theoretical concept.
No.
It has real-world implications for people's lives, for the future of nations, and for the way we think about identity and belonging in the 21st century.
And secondly, I think it's crucial to recognize that these movements are often rooted in these very real historical grievances and unresolved injustices.
And I can't just dismiss them as irrational or disruptive.
Exactly. We need to engage with those underlying issues if we hope to find lasting solutions.
And lastly?
And finally, I hope that this discussion has highlighted the importance of dialogue, empathy, and a willingness to consider multiple perspectives. You know, these are complex issues. There are no easy answers. Finding a path forward requires these open and honest conversations that involve all stakeholders.
This has definitely given us all a lot to ponder.
It has.
And I hope that our listeners will continue exploring these issues on their own.
Yes. There's a wealth of information out there. And it's up to each of us to engage with these complex questions in a thoughtful and informed way.
Well said.
Thank you.
As we've been going through this document, outlining the arguments for Igbo Biafra secession, I keep thinking about how complex this issue really is.
Absolutely.
I mean, we can't just view this as a black and white for or against secession debate, can we?
No, not at all. As with any social or political movement, there's a spectrum of opinions, approaches within the movement itself.
This document presents one perspective. But it's important to remember that not all Igbo people support secession. And those who do might have different ideas about how to achieve it.
So it's not a monolithic entity with everyone on the same page about the goals and strategies.
Exactly.
It's more nuanced than that.
Much more.
So while this document provides a compelling case for secession, we need to keep in mind that it represents one particular thread within a much larger tapestry.
Exactly. It's like we've looked at one piece of a very complex puzzle in great detail. But to see the full picture, we need to look at all the other pieces.
So what are some of those other pieces?
What are the perspectives of those who advocate for greater autonomy within Nigeria? What about those who believe that secession is not the answer? These are all voices that need to be part of the conversation. It seems like this internal debate within the Igbo community is just as important as the larger debate between those who support secession and those who oppose it.
These internal discussions, disagreements are what shape the movement's overall direction. They're essential for any movement striving for meaningful change.
We've explored so much.
We've covered a lot of ground.
The historical grievances, the legal arguments, the human rights concerns, the concept of self-determination, this whole idea of navigating identity and belonging within a nation state.
It is. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Thanks for guiding us through this intricate and thought-provoking